Well, welcome everybody. Happy Cinco de Mayo, and welcome to the May 2020 EWEB board meeting. We're doing it virtually this year. If there are any members out there in the live audience, thanks for playing along, and we hope to provide a meeting that is as useful and productive as it would be if it were a live session down at EWEB headquarters. Well, I will jump right into item number 1, and it is the agenda check. Can I just confirm that all 5 commissioners and our general manager Frank have a copy of the agenda in front of them, and digitally or otherwise? If anybody has any changes to the agenda, please let me know now by raising your hand. It appears that there are no changes to the agenda. We'll move into item number 2, and that's items from board members and the general manager. We will start with in the order in which I suppose we normally do. And Mindy Schlossberg sits furthest down to the, oh gosh, I guess furthest away from the river. We'll go from the furthest away of the river right down to the bank. So Mindy, you're up first.
Thank you. I don't really have anything this month other than to thank the EWEB staff for helping out members of our community who really are in need right now and making funds available for them to help keep their lights on and their water running. And that's it for me.
Great. Commissioner Carlson, I believe you're next.
I attended a virtual meeting for 2 virtual meetings for LCOG this last month, primarily grappling with similar things of how do we address the COVID crisis. And it looks like, just for a quick update on the census, that Lane County was at a 60% return rate, which is great. It was above the average for the state and for what we're seeing across the country. It surprises me because people have a lot of time at home and with computers, and it should be a very easy process. So if there are things you can do to help encourage people to continue to fill out that census, it's very important for the region. That's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Helgeson.
Well, I don't have anything really to report either. We've all been sort of confined to quarters, and I just want to express appreciation to EWEB staff and also to the community as a whole for the work that we're all doing to keep our community safe at this time. And I'm looking forward to the update on the agenda as to how that's all going in terms of EWEB's operations and our support for customers.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Helgeson. I'm next. I'll just echo really Dick's comments and those of Commissioner Schlossberg's as well. For any members of the EWEB staff that are listening in, I just wanted to express my appreciation as one of 5 board members. I know it's been probably extra hard and extra weird in lots of ways for our staff. Water and power are absolutely essential, and therefore so is your work. And for those of you who are having to do it under challenging circumstances, it's very much appreciated. Commissioner Brown.
I echo all the sentiments that previously been said, and for the record, I'd just like to state that Frank and I have been meeting with leadership of SUB regarding some real estate matters in Glenwood, and we continue to make progress on that. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Frank, if you'd like to weigh in, you have the opportunity to as well.
President Mattel, commissioners, staff members, public, good evening. I have just a few things I wanted to note this evening. First of all, appreciation for staff, not only for the response to the COVID pandemic and all the interesting challenges that come with that, but also this past weekend we had a windstorm blow through, and about 700 customers ended up losing power temporarily. Designers, support staff, crew members all pitched in to keep the lights on in that case. And so appreciate the fact that the lights stay on, the water keeps flowing as part of our response. I would also like to note some things are continuing, even though we're in a different work environment. The resource adequacy work is continuing. This is around Northwest regional adequacy for electricity. The Columbia River System operation and the environmental impact statement, that work continues with Bonneville. And so that type of work in our electrification study, which we're planning on some initial results in August, that is continuing. And so while we're working under a different environment, a lot of the work is continuing, just in a different form, in a different way. And I wanted to commend staff for continuing to do that, especially our IS staff for facilitating over 300 people to telework, which is really sets us up well for the future as well. So security staff, there's a lot of people that are doing what we do, and you'll learn more about that a little bit later, but wanted to send out my appreciation to staff and to leadership for what they've done, and to the board for your support as well. Thank you, President Mattel.
Does this mean that in addition to putting the HQ up for sale, we can put the rock up for sale as well, Frank?
Well, I'm actually hoping we don't do that. Maybe a part of the rock, but not the whole rock. So.
Everybody's is working from home just fine. What do we need the rock for? I'm just kidding, of course, everybody. All right, we will move on to our next item, which is public input. And if you're there, maybe you could let me know if there are if there's anything to be read into. If anybody submitted comments that need to be read at this point.
Hi, President Mattel. No, we received no public comment for this evening.
And I believe we had previously advertised that there would be no opportunity for live comment. So having received no comments in advance and no opportunity for live comment, I believe I do not even need to open up a public testimony session. Is that correct?
I believe so. There wouldn't be a way for folks to respond if they did wish to speak.
All right, well, I am therefore neither opening nor closing the public input session, and we will move into the next section of our agenda, which is the board action items. The first item is the approval of the consent calendar. Normally, I would just ask for a motion, but I'll just quickly, but since circumstances are a little bit different, folks might not have all this information in front of them. I'll just remind everybody that there are the minutes, there are 6 contracts and an intergovernmental agreement and 2 resolutions on our consent calendar. Do I hear any request to pull any of those items? Commissioner Halverson.
President Mattel, I'd like to pull for quick comment item number 8, the intergovernmental agreement with Energy Northwest.
Well, I was going to pull that one, but you beat me to it. Is there anything else like to, Sonia, would you like to pull something? You are muted, Sonia.
Thank you. Along that same vein, number 5, just so we can talk about the whole Stone Creek project as one.
All right, so anybody else like to pull anything?
Move to approve the rest.
Thank you. We have a motion to approve the balance of the consent calendar minus items number 5 and 8. Do we have a second?
Second.
From Commissioner Brown. All those in favor, please actually do raise your hand so I can see and say aye on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
Aye.
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 I believe that was unanimous. A set of ayes to pass the balance of the consent calendar. We'll take. We will discuss them in the order in which they're pulled. So why don't we pull number 8? Commissioner Helgeson, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm probably one of the few people in the virtual room that remembers when this project was initiated and how we came about our relationship with PGE. And I know that there were some questions that came up prior to the meeting for commissioners around kind of where we're at with this project generally. So it looks like we'll have an opportunity here to get more information for your benefit. I just want to say that in my experience, this has been one of the better small hydro projects that we've invested in over the years. It was actually a project that PGE itself wanted to develop back in the day and was a pretty attractive for them because it sits strategically within their transmission circuits. And I'm surprised to have lived long enough to see us come to a point where the contract for the current operation is coming up, but it looked to me, based on the staff response to our questions, that despite the fact that we're now proposing to contract with Energy Northwest for the operation, that will still be a positive addition to contribution margin over the next while. So I just wanted to acknowledge the relationship with PGE that we've had all these years, and to the extent there's an opportunity for staff to convey our appreciation, notwithstanding the fact that we're moving away from that relationship to PGE, I think that would be something that would be appropriate.
Well, I'll jump in the, go ahead, Frank.
Yes, Commissioner Helgeson, I think just a couple of background pieces of information would be helpful regarding Stone Creek. There are two contracts because there are two different pieces of infrastructure that need support. The Energy Northwest is specific to the generation site itself. Energy Northwest also provides O&M service to some other local hydro facilities in the Portland area. Therefore, it's probably more economical for them to do it than for us to travel the entire distance. Where we're contracting with PGE has to do with the transmission service. They made the choice not to continue to do O&M at cost for the actual generation site. So it might have been a little bit confusing. There's actually two components: the generation site itself and then the transmission. That's why there's two contracts. And I would echo that that of Commissioner Helgeson, which this has been a very highly performing plant for us. It continues to be that even under an increase in the O&M costs. The license lasts through 2038. It is also one of the few resources that we can use for what would be called a new large single load. If there was load that happened to come to Eugene, we could use that as a new large single load provider. So it's very flexible. It continues to provide positive margins for us, even though those margins probably aren't as favorable as when they were with PG&E, who basically was also servicing their own facilities in the area. So that's just a little bit of background. I know that with two contracts replacing one, sometimes it gets a little confusing. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify it.
Just one quick comment in addition to that, and that's that it's my recollection that one of the reasons PGE offered us kind of a sweet deal on the O&M from the get-go with some reasonable sort of escalation in it was because they were hoping that at some point we would sell the project to them. As I said, they had originally wanted to develop themselves, and it's ideally positioned within their generation mix and area. And so I think that given that we've not proposed at any point to offer the plant for them, and because it continues to be a positive revenue producing asset for us, that's not likely that might be a contributing factor why they're no longer interested in maintaining and operating the facility for us.
That's correct, Commissioner.
I'm going to jump in the queue. Sorry, Sonia, I didn't see your hand until just now. I'll get to you in just a moment. Yeah, my questions have largely been answered just based on the comments provided by Frank, but so it sounds like the NPV is still positive and that we are not interested in selling it right now. The question I suppose that's remaining is, should we become interested in selling that sometime before either of those two contracts is set to expire? Is there anything in those contracts that would make that more difficult to do so?
President Mattel, no, there are not. Those are like a lot of our contracts. Those are one-year interval contracts, and so we could end those for that reason, or if we're not happy with the performance of those contracts.
Okay, thank you. And just so you know, the other commissioners, some of you, you're very, very small on my screen. If you have your hands just up only a tiny bit, it's actually hard to see. If you put them up a little higher, I'll notice them that much easier. Commissioner Carlson, go ahead.
Okay, great. I just wanted to say that my answers, or the questions that I had largely been answered as well, given the background. and concern about kind of when this project came due. I'm glad to hear that we have a number of years past the end of this contract that it's still operating and it's operating in the positive. So I'm good to move forward, and I'm good on number 5 as well. So I don't need further discussion on number 5 personally, since I was the one that pulled it. So
thank you.
I'm happy to, unless others have other conversation, I'm more than happy to move that we approve both numbers 5 and 8.
Seconded.
All right, well, we have a motion. I believe discussion's complete. We have a motion to approve numbers 5 and 8 on the consent calendar. Can I have all those in favor, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
5 ayes. I don't really know. Does anybody, we'll find out in a moment. Does anybody have to say nay? All right, I'm going to assume therefore that was a unanimous vote in support of those 2 contracts. Hold on just a moment and we'll move into the next item as soon as I can remind myself what it is. All right, number 6 is the General Manager's Annual Performance Evaluation and Merit Discussion for the 2019 calendar year. I will initiate the discussion and offer each of the commissioners to make any statements if they so choose, and give Frank an opportunity to weigh in as well. So just very briefly, I'll say that we updated our evaluation process slightly this past year, and I want to thank Lena for her support of that. We, in the last 6 weeks or so, each of us has completed a performance evaluation. HR consolidated those. We each had the opportunity to review each other's comments and ratings in full, and therefore, and then also had an opportunity to make changes to our own in light of what our fellow commissioners had to say and the things that they may have noticed and perhaps we have missed. That process wrapped up a week ago or so. Frank had an opportunity then to see the final performance evaluation, and we also, as a group, the 5 of us plus Frank, had an opportunity to review that in executive session just now. So I'll just provide a few additional comments and then open it up for commissioners. I want to say that the performance eval covers the 2019 calendar year. There were 4 categories similar to the performance eval that's available for all of the other MAPT staff at EWEB. Frank ranked exceptionally high and high in all of those categories, and in most of them, most commissioners in every case voted him exceptionally high. This puts him in the top 9% of all EWEB MAPT staff, as 9% received the exceptional ranking, and another 26% got the highly ranking. So that just gives everybody a sense of where Frank fits in. We see him as a very valuable general manager, and that was largely expressed. His salary, he had a merit increase that was automatic at the beginning of the year, just like of the rest of the MAPT. That was a 2.4% increase, and so his salary went from roughly $311,000 to $319,000 at the beginning of the calendar year, as per the contract that's written. So the document that we made available, or that we made available to Frank, I believe is being submitted into the public record. Frank, I just want to say on my own behalf, and I'll open it up to the other commissioners in just a moment, that we're very thankful for your leadership. I feel that EWEB is moving in a really strong direction. Some of the things that you in particular have added that to the role of general manager is provided strategic leadership, and very and written in clearly in the form of a strategic plan and clearly written goals for the year and for the 5-year period ahead of us. And you also do an evaluation every year and let us know exactly how we are tracking relative to those goals, and have invited us to rate you according to the goals of the institution. And that's something I am deeply thankful for, as I think it's an important element of leadership to take that level of responsibility. We will address the question of merit in just and potential increase in just a moment, but I want to open it up to the other commissioners to weigh in and provide any feedback that they would like to. Once again, we could go in order from furthest away from the river to closest. So Commissioner Schlossberg, that brings you up next.
Thank you. I just want to echo your comments, President Mattel. Thank you, Frank, for your leadership. And I guess I just want to add that I really appreciate your aspirational leadership, how you're not just satisfied with chugging along and keeping things as they are, but you really have a vision for the agency, and I appreciate how thoughtful you are in being forward thinking. One other thing I'd like to add is in this process, I just want to thank you and the executive team for being available to our fielding our questions and our feedback about your performance. That was invaluable, and I know that we all really appreciate their input as well. And that is it.
Commissioner Carlson.
Nope, I thought Dick was next. Yeah, Frank, thank you so much for everything that you've done. And, you know, I mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. The team that you've built, and, you know, being a leader is not just about, you know, being your best self. It's about how you organize people and the people you bring to the table and how you motivate them. And I think that, you know, you have a very open door policy. I think you've positively changed the EWEB culture. I think that you've created, with a lot of support from your team, a really high functioning group. And it shows in every aspect of how the organization has evolved over the last number of years. And I'm thankful that I get to be a small part of it. And I thank you for your leadership in helping make that all happen. And I'm really appreciative to the team that supports you to help you shine too. So thank you for all of that great work, and looking forward to tackling some really big challenges ahead.
It's almost over, Frank. Commissioner Helgeson.
Okay, thank you. I too am pleased with the direction and the results organizationally, and Frank's leadership over the past year. Leadership is critical in any organization, and it's a challenging thing, and it also requires support from other capable leaders, such as those that are part of the management team here at EWEB. And so I want to express my appreciation to Frank and to the rest of you for another good year and progress on our goals and strategic objectives. I also, because Frank is always pointing out to us that that his performance is really just a reflection of the performance of the organization as a whole, I want to point out that even though leadership is necessary and critical to an organization, that it's not necessarily sufficient to provide excellent performance, and that credit goes once again to the whole organization. And I just want to extend my appreciation for the things that are reflected in Frank's report on status of the organization that we had the opportunity to review as part of this process. So thank you, Frank, and thanks to the rest of you for the work that you're doing.
Commissioner Brown.
Well, thank you. For brevity, I won't repeat what's already been said. I agree with everything, but I think that Frank, you know, exemplary is the word I use quite a bit, but you've done a great job in the past, and I'm so grateful that we have you and everybody at EWEB going into the future, because it's totally uncharted. And I think of anybody I'd want at the helm of this organization, it's you and your executive team and all the people that work at EWEB, because we've got some challenges we're facing, and I don't think we could face them with a better group. We're going to be challenged, but I think we're up to the challenge. So thank you for everything you've done and everything you're going to do.
Frank, if you'd like to make any comments, now would be your chance, and then we'll get to a brief merit discussion.
So, President Mattel, Commissioners, first of all, thank you for a couple of things. One is we all recognize, especially as leaders, that going through an evaluation is an important process, and thank you for the detail that you provided. Doing an evaluation is one of the most important things that we do as leaders, evaluating both ourselves, the organization, those who report to us, our peers. It's an important feedback process, and I appreciate the time and effort that you went through, as well as Lena went through to facilitate it, and also for your leadership and guidance along the way. I think it's important that you function very well as a team, which you do, and you're respectful of each other and provide guidance to me and the organization. I think also that it is important to recognize that I am a reflection of the organization, and how we perform matters. It matters to our customer owners, it matters to the community, it matters to each other. And we set and are setting expectations that we want to live up to. Sometimes that means that you don't meet a goal. You have to adjust, you have to realize it, you have to change your approach going forward. You have to admit it, you have to understand it. Both results and methods matter in the long term. And so I think it's an opportunity to continue to get better. I'm excited about where we've come, but I'm actually more excited about where we're going. I know that it sounds a little bit tumultuous where we're going, but I think there's opportunity in it. And we're going to have to work very closely together, the board, leadership, staff, to create something that the community is ultimately very proud of. That's the objective. It's their money. We work for the community, you represent the community, and that's really important to all of us. So thanks for the direct feedback. I will note that when it comes to compensation, as an organization, we look at 3 components. One is how competitive is the particular position. I think that's been addressed in my case. We try to make sure we're competitive with all positions. We also look at performance. Results do count. And then we look at a third component, which is our ability to reward, our ability to pay. And that's something that we know that there's struggles in the community. We want to make sure we're doing it in the context of our budget and our financial constraints. And so those are the 3 things we look at within the organization, and I would expect the board to look at those same things. But yes, thank you for the feedback. I appreciated it. I learned from it. And I definitely appreciate the team that I have and the staff that we have. They make me proud every day. And so with that, I'll just turn it back to you, President Mattel. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. We're almost done. Normally, this would be the opportunity in the moment for somebody, one of the 5 commissioners, to make a motion if he or she so chose to and seek support from the other commissioners for some kind of a merit increase to reflect the excellent performance evaluation that we just gave you. And so that's where we would be right now. My own feeling is that despite that under normal circumstances, without the COVID issue that we're now facing, we one of us, and I believe supported by all of us, would make exactly a recommendation just like that, for some kind of a merit increase to reflect the excellent performance that you did and the value that you had last year and the value you brought to the institution. But we are facing extremely unusual times. There is a lot of sacrifice at EWEB and elsewhere in the community. We're seeing other leaders, not just of utilities, but all kinds of public and private agencies willingly taking a pay cut. We are not asking for or recommending a pay cut at the top or anywhere within EWEB at this point in time. But I do feel like it's not the appropriate moment to provide a merit increase, largely, or essentially entirely, because of the signals it might send to those in our own institution and more broadly across the region. So there's no motion that I am making, but I wanted to be clear that there was a reason why. I'll open it up to other commissioners if anybody would like to say anything. Commissioner Brown.
I concur. I think Frank is deserving of it, but I think given the exact reasons that you stated so well, that it's not a good time. It's the optics, and we have to lead by example, and this is the first example. Hopefully we don't have to go further, but I think to give a merit increase at this time would not be appropriate.
If anybody thinks differently, now would be your opportunity to voice that. There's no motion on the table, but if anybody would like to put one on the table, now's your chance. All right, any concluding comments from anybody before we move into our next agenda item? Looks like we have something from Dick Helgeson, and then Frank, I'll give you the final word.
Okay, thank you. Well, I just, without further comments, say I concur with what was said just earlier in terms of not taking action on merit at this point. I would like to ask, though, that we stay clear, and I think we made good progress last year when we made amendments to the contract with our general manager that eliminated a considerable amount of previous ambiguity about how our compensation process was to work. And so I think we have a much clearer set of parameters in the contract now that were all vetted and approved in public session back in December, I believe. I would just ask that with some help from our HR manager that we make sure that we're all clear about what those mechanics are in terms of base pay adjustment in the beginning of the year, merit consideration, even though we're foregoing it this year, and also kind of how that fits into the concepts of potentially one-time bonuses or other consideration, so that as we go forward and as we revisit this process next year, that we are all clear and stay clear about how those mechanics are supposed to work. The other thing that I would ask is for some clarity as to whether or not we're going to continue to maintain a market reference and a set of comparators that we would occasionally review, just to make sure that as those mechanics work through in future timeframes, that we always have an external reference to consider. And I know that while we're not replicating that this year at this time, that it's important to have that as an element for reference in the future. And I also know that there was some change in the availability of survey data and the number of comparators that we had. So if with some help from Lena, we could both clarify and make sure we're all on the same page in our understanding of how the mechanics are to work, even though we're not exercising the merit component this year, and also leaving the conversation with some renewed clarity about whether or not and how we're to go about maintaining that external reference in the future. I would appreciate that, and I think it would serve us well to make sure that we don't leave the conversation this year without making sure that we have enough information in the record about those components that we have something to refer back to next year. Thank you.
So Dick, I believe that was a request that needs to be supported by other commissioners for some kind of a backgrounder type document produced by Lena. Is that addressing those handful of points that you just made?
Well, I guess I will make that request. That would be one way to respond to the interests that I've just expressed. If in the process of figuring out how best to do that, you could be in consultation with Lena to kind of represent what we're looking for there, I would appreciate that. And that's all subject to there being at least two others on the board who would support me in this request.
Well, we'll take that. We have support for a backgrounder document to help us get back up to speed about our external reference points for Frank's salary and other and some of the other considerations to make sure that we're staying where we want to be relative to our peers across the region. So I'll certainly support that. Frank, I'll get your question in just a moment. It looks like we have support. Lena, I hope you were taking notes because I think that assignment is going to land on your desk. Dick asked me to represent that, but I'm going to put it back on him. Nobody knows what he wants better than him. Dick, would you mind being our representative with Lena to get clear on what questions we want to be answered in that document?
Sure, I'm happy to do that, and I won't stray from the things that have been discussed here.
I trust you won't, Dick. I don't have any doubt about that for a moment. Lena, I don't think we need to address this issue just now, but I guess Dick will be giving you a call in the next day or two to flesh that out.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you. Frank, we got a little astray there with some detail, but nonetheless, you got a great performance evaluation, and I think we should end on that high note and give you the last word.
Thank you, President Mattel and Commissioners. I would, Commissioner Helgeson's questions aside, I would note that at the beginning of every year, part of the standard process that Lena goes through is to provide the board in January with an update relative to any changes in compensation for not just myself, but for the organization and where that would fit me in the competitive range. So I actually believe that's already covered. And then it's updated automatically annually. I would still, Commissioner Helgeson can still reach out to Lena Kostopoulos if he has further questions, but I think that's in many ways already covered. What the board just mentioned relative to a compensation award is consistent with the way we view the organization. That's always been important to me, that I am treated the same way that we treat the entire organization relative to how we look at compensation, how we're competitive, and how we reward people. And so I certainly appreciate and understand the board's position. I do have a competitive compensation package relative to my peers. And so I absolutely agree with it and understand it. So thank you mostly for the evaluation itself, and thanks to leadership and staff for their support and for their pursuit of our goals in service of the community. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, well, thank you. Glad to do it. We will move on to our next agenda item, which is actually scheduled a break. There's no cheesecake to run off and get unless you have some in your own cupboards. I don't. Let me just poll the board real quick and find out whether we want to indeed take that break. We're about 30 minutes, 25 minutes ahead of schedule right now. If anybody needs a break, we will gladly take it. If folks want to trudge on through, we can do that as well. Those in favor of taking a break, raise your hand. Seeing none, we will just continue on through. Our next item is number 8. That's the COVID-19 customer assistance update. And I believe it's being, led by Julie and Renee and Anna.
Do you want to tell me when you can see all of us? Are Renee and Anna up?
You are all visible, at least to me, but only one person at a time on the screen is the way it's working.
Okay, perfect. I'll get started. Good evening, Commissioners. Julie McGahee, Chief Customer Officer. Tonight we have Renee Gonzalez, Customer Solutions Manager, and Anna Wade, Business Line Manager, talking to us about EWEB's efforts around COVID-19 customer assistance. And Renee, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Julie. Travis, can we move? Next slide, please. Thank you so much. So good evening, President Mattal, Commissioners, and Manager Lawson. As you most likely know, EWEB developed and implemented a variety of relief efforts for customers early in the crisis. And to ensure customers wouldn't go without critical services, we suspended shutoffs and late fees to residential and commercial customers. We also increased funding to increase the number of ECC recipients, and we expanded qualifying criteria to include job loss for those customers who have lost their jobs. We've also expanded residential payment plans and empowered staff to allocate crisis funding on a case-by-case basis, and we simplified processes by expanding proof of eligibility options and implemented a mail-in process for senior and disabled customers for whom in-person or online application might pose significant challenges. Currently, we're working on potential solutions for general service, better known as commercial customers, and Anna will provide more information on that and details on continued funding allocation. So pass it to you, Anna.
Thanks, Renee, and thank you, Julie. Good evening, Commissioners. Good to see familiar faces from the Wade bunker. Travis, can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. So EWEB customer care truly exists in a state of continuous improvement. Every single month this year, we have found ways to improve our process efficiency, our program accessibility, or customer experience. We've been able to make decisions on the fly and pivot in real time, which would not have been possible had we not brought the program in-house at the start of the year. So very grateful for that decision, especially in COVIDian times. So let's jump into some numbers and see where we're at. I know, commissioners, I apologize that you can't see these slides very well. Hopefully you were able to preview the memo. It also included that data. The ECC, the 2020 ECC table literally highlights decisions made in mid-March to respond to the emerging COVID-19 crisis. With the abrupt announcement of shutdowns, we knew that the community would absolutely need our support. In April, we had originally planned for $90,000 in ECC funds, but we raised the bar to $260,000 so that we could award benefits to 1,000 customers. Just so that you know, Q2 and Q3 are typically troughs in bill assistance spending. Obviously not the case this year. So in April, we awarded nearly as much as was planned for the entire quarter. But even with such a huge increase, ECC was closed after the first hour in both April and May. So absolutely, the demand is outstripping supply. I want to draw your attention to the totals at the right of the table. As you can see at the end of the prior line, we already had forecasted spending of just over 1.4 million, which is more than 270,000 above our working budget of 1.2. Currently, with our updated numbers, the planned overspend is now over $500,000. We will rely on customer donations to account for the delta between that working budget number and the total spend at year end. The great news is that we started with a surplus. As you probably recall, we were able to fund increased customer credits last year through administrative savings. So we did not draw from donations to augment ECC as we have done regularly in the past. Important to note, however, the current allocation schedule that you have before you will take that funding source down to a minimal balance. The second table, you can see in 2019, EWEB provided over $1 million in bill assistance to almost 4,300 customers. Liheap awarded an additional 1.1 million to around 3,400 EWEB customers. So it goes without saying that both sources of support are crucial to our community. So I want to talk a little bit more about Liheap for those that aren't as familiar with this program. Liheap is not an EWEB ratepayer funded program. EWEB has contracts with the county and with the state of Oregon to apply credits to customer accounts, for which the utility is later reimbursed. Liheap funding is uncertain. It's literally an act of Congress every year to determine that amount. And the federal requirements for income verification are burdensome for our community partners, like Lane County, as well as Campbell Senior Center and Catholic Community Services. Unlike ECC at $260, the Liheap amount varies from customer to customer. On the slide, you can see the 2019 average was around $400, but looking at the data, I saw credits as high as $1,200 and as low as $65. So huge standard deviation there. Liheap operates on a fiscal calendar, which begins on October 1st. The application opens on the first business day of each month. However, Liheap is not available year-round. They typically stop taking applications in December or early January, depending on if they get additional funding. And I want to drill into this point a little bit because it's not evident in the data, and also I think Commissioner Schlossberg had some questions about this. So if you look at 2019 assistance for Liheap, let's start with October. Not a lot going on there, less than $4,000 in that first month that they start taking applications. And then there's a big bump up in November with large assistance numbers carrying through Q1. And as you can see, Liheap begins to taper in Q2 and is virtually non-existent in Q3. So they stop taking applications early January, and then they devote Q1 and Q2 to income verification and awarding the actual funds. Much of this process is attributable to the rigorous intake requirements mandated by the Fed, excuse me. And I want to be clear, it's not the local agencies are doing a bad job. In fact, they're working their tails off. It's just that they have an impossible job to do if the goal is to get money to those who need it immediately and efficiently. So in this way, I would suggest ECC really helps to balance the flow of Liheap dollars and vice versa. So I think that covers our status update for residential assistance programs. Travis, can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. As you probably know, general service customers do not qualify for ECC. While all customer rates fund our assistance programs, there is not a general service equivalent. Given our current crisis, we are working to expand our portfolio of programs. Small business means a whole lot to our community. I probably don't need to go into this, but I will just a little bit. They provide jobs, and yes, they generate revenues for the utility, but I think it's a lot more than that. Small businesses define the character and the livability of Eugene, whether it's a restaurant or a yoga studio or your favorite grocer. These are the places that you take out-of-town company to with a sense of local pride. And our local entrepreneurs are resourceful. They're trying really hard during this period. I've read that Marley's Monsters is staffing up to mass produce reusable masks. Thinking Tree Distillery pivoted and is now making hand sanitizer for the state of Oregon. And restaurants are completely changing their business model to do takeout. So they're trying really, really hard. But many small businesses are getting absolutely hammered by the shutdown. And once that's over, once the shutdown has been lifted, many are going to face higher costs as they re-inventory, as they account for social distancing within their establishments, and as they bring back a labor force. They will likely do so with tepid demand, as we all kind of get comfortable coming back into the public sphere. So I will get back to the slide. Here we go. Within the Small Business Recovery Program, we're looking at two different options. So the first, for customers that have accrued a balance, we aim to offer a deferred payment plan. The existing balance may be deferred for a period of time, say up to 6 months, with a payback schedule of 12 to 24. So long, of course, as the customer continues to make full payment on the current charges. This will allow these customers to get back up and running without the weight of higher utility costs during this period. The second option for customers that have managed to maintain a current account balance, but face similar restart obstacles, we aim to offer a reduced payment plan using our budget billing module. So for example, we may offer a fixed monthly payment of 85 to 90% of their 12-month average. These accounts would then go through that first year at the reduced amount and then true up through their second year. In either case, application approvals will be based on observable creditworthiness, and it is our goal to allow customer-specific terms within established limits so that we have flexibility and we meet them where they're at as individuals. To reiterate, this is not a grant, but rather a structured approach to helping GS customers pay back what they owe in a time frame that increases their ability to thrive and contribute to the community in years to come. So that's like 10,000 feet in looking at our current general service efforts. The last thing I do want to touch on is payment plans. So this is a must-do effort as our AR balances have been growing. We have a horizontal team including IS, finance, and customer solutions working together to leverage existing CIS modules to create greater flexibility. So some of the priorities for this group, first and foremost, we need to allow longer payback periods. We're pretty sure that's going to be essential. Two, we want to the extent possible, address bill presentment so that it's clear to customers each month what they owe versus the component of their bill that covers that back pay. And then lastly, of course, we need to accommodate prudent financial monitoring on the balances and ensure existing reports will need to take into account accurate inclusion of these new programs. So that's about it. Nothing I've touched on today is tactically or financially simple to the utility. It is complicated, but a lot of the things that we're working on are, and yet everything that we do for our customers needs to be easy for them to understand and apply for. So customer experience will continue to be our goal. With that, we're open to questions, astute observations, etc. Thank you.
All right, I'll open up a queue in just a moment. Just a reminder, I forgot to say at the beginning, we have 30 minutes for this agenda item, and I set my trusty pocket watch here. So there are about 18 minutes remaining for Q&A. I'll just frame it up a little bit by saying that I think one of the big questions potentially out there for the commissioners to wrestle with is it enough? I wasn't here in 2008, but I know a little bit about the history, and at that point in time, commissioners decided to dramatically increase the budget for our customer care like programs. So I'm guessing that's large. That's on all of our minds, and potentially an option for us to exercise. We do have that discretion if a majority of us choose to exercise it. So that might not be the only question, but I'm sure it's potentially one of them out there. I'll open up a queue if anybody wants to jump in it. It looks like, could you all hold your hands up? If I see John Brown, but that's all right now. All right, John Brown, go ahead.
Thank you for the great presentation. I'll just let you know that you just came over the internet. You had a good article in the River Reflections about EWEB's assistance program. Just came out. I just saw it a few minutes ago. That said, number one, the assistance program, the bill deferment for commercial customers, are you going to do an outreach to, I have an interest in a property management company, and we manage many retail, office, industrial people, and especially the retail are getting hit hard. So we can convey this information to them about their ability to the deferred payments and things such as that. The presentation you just gave us, Anna.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that have been critical through this time is the work done by our communications staff. So the article you just mentioned, Jen Connors has been one of our point people. So we've gotten the message out there, and it's helped us on a lot of different fronts. With regard to our general service offerings, yes, we want to get information out as soon as possible. We're trying to get enough of the nuts and bolts together that we don't issue a decree without some sense of here's generally what we're trying to offer. But yes, as soon as we do, Jen will be my partner in developing a broad customer communication plan, letting them know generally who will qualify and what we'll need from them.
Okay, and my second question is on the Q1 strategic operational report on page 12. We have some statistics on the ECC program, and I see that we budgeted 1.1 million, but we're projected for 1.7. The math didn't work because, or at least I don't know how this works, because year to date is 712,000 for 4 months. And so if I extrapolate that out to an annual base, or is it going, what's the 1.7 million refer to? Because obviously we projected 90,000 in April, and we allocated 260. I'm just wondering how the 712.4 for the first 4 months equates to 1.7 million on an annual basis.
Sure. Hey, Travis, you want to kick back to the previous slide? So thank you. All right, let's take a look. So the 1.7 is basically, okay, what did we award in January, February, March? So as you look across there, those are the actual amounts that were awarded in each of those months. From there, it's really just a forecast. So the reason that number can move around, there's a couple different reasons. So one, we actually have quite a few outstanding applications that have been received year to date and referred out to the agencies. So we believe that those funds will be awarded, but I'm talking, I think it's about 200 applications that are sitting and waiting, and that was before we opened last Friday for May. So there can be a difference between, okay, we opened up April to 1,000 applications, or the equivalent of 260. That number may be less than that if we have customers that fail to meet appointments or come in. So the 1.7 is the math of year-to-date actuals plus a forward forecast.
Okay, because the chart I have has April at 260, March 147, 160. I can't read the chart up there, so yeah, this is the same number. So I'm just wondering if because I know where we're going to go with this, or at least I can sense it. about maybe increasing it, because if it runs out in an hour, that tells you something very quickly. So thank you.
All right, I'm going to let Frank or Renee, Frank, your choice, one of the two of you jump in and add any more detail that you'd like.
Yeah, I'll jump in first and then Renee can supplement. Commissioner Brown, I think relative to your question, as well as Commissioner or President Mattel's observation around funding levels, we need to make that kind of decision in the context of our forward financial forecast, of which we would like to bring to the board more detail in June. At this point, we do think there's an opportunity to help both residential and general service commercial customers. This is where the plan is heading, but we really want to bring something back in June that's fully baked, so that the board can also understand our go forward forecasts. It would be a shame to put such financial strain on the organization because we increase funding only to have to turn around and raise rates in the fall. And so if that's the choice, we want to do it fully transparently and expose what we think we're going to be going through. I'll talk a little bit more about what those parameters look like in the next presentation. This is where our thinking is at the moment. Staff's done a really good job of putting the pieces together, but we want to make sure that the board and all of us are making these financial choices with all eyes open relative to what our future financial picture might look like. Renee, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think you said it already, Frank. Just want to add real quick that in regards to the allocation amounts, the 1.1 million budgeted versus the 1.7 million actual, that delta is being funded from customer donations fund. So just that way. Yeah. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you for that reminder. All right, Sonia, I think you had your hand up. I can't remember anymore. Is that correct? Yeah, why don't you go next, and then Commissioner Helgeson after you.
So I just wanted to confirm, I think when we hit the 1,000 mark of applications, then we don't take more than that. So we don't have a sense of how many more than that how much more demand past that 1,000 is out there. Is that correct?
That's correct. And one of the things that I was alluding to early on in the presentation is that, you know, having this program in-house, I can actually see the demand. I can actually see what the phone load is. I can see how many applications are coming in per minute. And I can see that pace grow and then, you know, slow down as we start to wind down the program. So we don't have perfect data around what happens as soon as, or how many people are knocking on the door afterwards. But we are getting a much better sense of pacing and what that immediate demand is. Because we can see it now.
That's great. Thank you so much. I mean, I know that it's such a difficult time. I know that the issue was raised of potentially increasing the fund. I'm certainly willing to look at it. I know we have some reserves that have been higher. I also know that we're, you know, depending on how long we think this all will last, I don't know how long those reserves get us there, but it would certainly be helpful for me to see what, you know, some kind of quick modeling, I guess, to see what kind of is the worst case scenario and what's the upside. Maybe best case scenario, we have another wave and we have to close again, and then worst case scenario, we're in it for the next 2 years, or maybe even longer. But that's kind of what the gamut seems to be. And I would certainly, I think that the governor made a plan and was talking about that it's extended at least through July 6th, which means I think everybody is going to continue to be in a lockdown mode at least until then, and maybe past then. Granted, right now we usually have lower load because we're not heating. It's at least a little bit easier to deal with there. But anyway, I would certainly just wanted to put out that, you know, I might have some potential support there if we have a prudent way to do that, just because of how much need there is out in the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hubson.
I just want to appreciate Frank's comments. I would like to be responsive to the need. I think that's a bit of a balancing act in terms of protecting the financial health of the utility, particularly coming on the heels of a number of years where we've cut costs and built reserves. And I would want to make a decision, as Frank has suggested, in the context of an understanding of the big picture. And that's notwithstanding the fact that I'd like to be as responsive as we can reasonably be, and find that appropriate trade-off place. I think, you know, one reality is that with the level of at least hopefully short-term unemployment that we're likely to be seeing here, that there's probably no way we're going to meet the need. So, you know, it's more than just putting more money in the budget. It's also a matter of figuring out, okay, so we double the budget. Now we can take a 2,000 requests, but then, you know, there's a long line out the door after that. So, you know, how do we kind of address the situation holistically with whatever resources we can bring to bear? And I also would point out, as part of that big picture, that there may be some actions taken by Congress that further supplement the Liheap budget, which we want to take into consideration as well. But I would like to discuss that further in the context of a kind of a bigger picture understanding. And if that's something that can be done as early as June, then I'd be comfortable with that timing.
Well, I'll jump in the queue myself and just follow on the comments made already. So I will withhold the urge to take some action this evening. So and largely because of things that Frank said and echoed by others. I guess I would like to see if there's support around the virtual table by my other commissioners for a set of options. Kind of a to give us a sense of what things look like, a do nothing or do no more option, all the way up to a pretty aggressive and painful one, and something in between, or maybe even two in between, so that not only do we have a sense of what we can do, we have a sense of what too far looks like as well. So that'd be my request, to help us queue up this decision next month, like what our reserves look like, as Sonia said, what the outlook looks like forward, and then a set of options for us to consider. So that's my request, to see if there's any support for that from the other board members, to ask staff to prepare something like that for our June meeting. I see Sonia's hand up, and I think I saw John Brown's. I see Mindy's as well. Looks like there's unanimous support for a minimum of 3 options, sort of a low, medium, high. But if staff decide to increase that to 4 or 5, I don't think we would complain.
Steve, I just want to say I support the request for options. I think it's probably part of what we need to consider in the context of that big picture Frank was talking about. I just don't want to consider this one thing in isolation. I want to know what the trade-offs are in terms of levels of reserves, needs for other things, because we're going to be short on revenue. If you looked at the revenue projections and our experience so far in this circumstance. So I certainly support options, and this is something I'd want to consider, but I want to take that as kind of a trade-off decision against all the other needs that face the community and the utility.
Yeah, absolutely. I assume those options will come complete with that kind of analysis. This is what it would cost us now and potentially in the future, and this is where the money would have to come from, and actions we might have to take if we were to move forward with any one of those options. So I assume it would be a fairly complete analysis for us to review and respond to. Sonia, I see your hand up, but before we come to you, I want to give Mindy an opportunity to weigh in if she chooses. She hasn't had a chance to say anything this first round.
I don't have any additional questions, but I appreciate you answering my previous questions about Liheap and the reduced ECC funding in the latter half of the year. So thank you for that.
Okay, well, we'll open up. Let me just check the time remaining in this section. We have just a little over 3 minutes. If we need to extend it, I suppose we can check in on that. So we'll open up a second round if anybody has any follow-up questions. Commissioner Carlson, I think you may have had one.
Just 2 quick comments on the options that are being brought back. One, we might want to look at, a timing of release. So we have, a portion of the funding that we fill back in for the winter months when we don't know what the winter is going to look like. That could be it could be a very drastic winter, and we might have an even higher need at that point. Who knows? So definitely, whenever you bring, when the options are available, we should definitely look at the timing of how those come in. And then the second piece was, I don't want to forget about the business aspect too, if there's anything else that we can do to enhance those. Just as Anna brought up earlier, the businesses make our community, they support jobs, and they're going to be really struggling to get by, especially the longer this drags on. So if there's, other things that we can do. I know we were looking primarily at the ECC program for maybe increasing funding. Maybe there's other things that we can do to help support businesses too. I don't know, but I just wanted to make sure that wasn't lost. So, thanks.
Go ahead, Dick, go ahead.
Just a quick comment on the small business component. I'm glad we're looking at that. I like the conceptual approach. There are a couple of things that concern me, that notwithstanding. One is that I think we need to clearly define who small business is, because there may be some businesses in the community that are large enough and have the capabilities to ride this out without needing our support. It's less of a consideration if it isn't a grant. But I am aware of some small to middle-end businesses in the community who actually have been doing reasonably well under the circumstances. Construction firms that have public works contracts that continue in force. And I noted that under the Congress's relief package, that even those small businesses that aren't experiencing a particular financial hardship, and everybody understands and appreciates the contribution that they make to the local economy and to who we are. But I'm aware of some who applied for and qualified for loans when they haven't had to lay anybody off and they're working full tilt on their construction projects, but yet qualifying for federal assistance that just goes straight to their bottom line, which kind of surprised me. And I know we wouldn't do something like that, but I would just hope that in keeping it simple, that there's some consideration given to what small business is and how that's defined, and also that it's in fact a business. Like I'm not sure Albertsons necessarily needs bill assistance as a large, corporation that operates through this crisis. And I'm sure that those are all things that are being considered. So thanks for the opportunity to comment.
Sorry, I see, if I can get a show of hands to see how many people feel like they have something they need to say. It's like John Brown, Renee, Frank, I was going to give you the last word to help us tidy up. Is that what anybody else? All right, well, the 30 minutes has elapsed, but I'll just take the opportunity to extend it a couple minutes to get these last few comments in. And then again, Frank, you'll have the final word, tidy up, make sure that we're all clear with what the expectations are going forward. So John Brown, why don't you go ahead, and then Renee, you'll have a chance, and so will Frank.
I just appreciate everything that's been said. I just would want to give staff just a reminder that if they're talking about timing and funding and impacts, in middle of November, property taxes become due, and they're a much greater expense than utilities, and they'll take priority to a lot of people because unpaid taxes accrue interest at 16%. And so if you're talking about timing in the winter, whether it's residential or commercial, it doesn't matter. Everybody has to pay them, and they're not going to reflect this decline in the economy because it goes back to January 1st of 2020. So it's going to be a huge, in my opinion, it's going to be a pretty significant impact, and I think you need to keep that in mind in the timing of the funding. So thank you.
There are two things I didn't know. Renee, go ahead.
Thank you, President Mittal. Just acknowledging Commissioner Helgeson's comments and informing the board that just about everything Commissioner Helgeson expressed are things that we are currently looking at. We didn't provide a lot of like process behind the scenes information. We really just wanted to know if we're headed in the right direction regarding general services customers. So the definition of what a small business customer is, and the other concerns expressed by Commissioner Helgeson we're looking into. And also there's an important component regarding nonprofits, right? We haven't touched on those. They play a specific role in the community, and that's also something that we're working on. So more to come on those, 2-3 things. That's it.
Thank you. All right, Frank, why don't you have the last word?
Thank you, President Mattel, Commissioners. We appreciate your comments. They're very insightful, and they tie in quite well with the next presentation around COVID recovery and providing the overall context for which we're going to look at these issues. There are a number of scenarios that we're looking at. And as far as timing, I don't believe that this is a one and done type of decision. I do believe that as our community recovers, as the challenges either extend or they don't, we are going to be able to work with you as the board to make adjustments within our capabilities to help the community and also within the right context. I'll provide this, like I said, I think we have a very clear view of what you're asking for. It aligns with our thinking already, and we'll get into a little bit more of what that looks like in the next presentation.
All right, well, with that, we'll close out that item and move into item number 9. Actually, before we do so, just a quick check. We have, according to the clock, about, I'm going to guess 40 minutes of material yet to cover. Does if anybody wants a break, probably now's the time to do it. Otherwise, we'll just run to the finish line. Anybody raise your hand if anybody wants to take a break. Otherwise, we have 40 minutes, give or take, to go. Frank, you do want a break?
Yeah, maybe 2 minutes.
Well, I wonder what you need to do. All right, well, then it looks like we're taking a couple of minutes break. According to my calendar, it's 7:12. We will be back here at, we'll do 5 minutes, at 7:17.
Thank you, President Mattel.
Sure thing. All right, we'll get started as soon as I see all 5 commissioners. Right now, missing, if you're back, if you don't mind, yeah, exactly. Thank you, putting your screen on. Well, I don't know about the rest so I'll call the session back into order. I don't know about the rest of you, but I was thinking about a scene from The Naked Gun while we were on break. I'll leave it at that. Glad somebody knows what I'm referring to. Hold on a second. I'm needing to pull up my copy of the agenda. All right, we are in item number 9, the COVID-19 pandemic proposed recovery, and I think that's with Frank, and I'm going to put 20 minutes on the clock.
President Mattel, Commissioners, thank you. Been actually looking forward to this presentation for some time. We do get asked quite often how we are responding to COVID and what we're planning around relative to the future. If our producer could load the presentation, then I will go ahead and get started. Great, thanks. Next slide, please. So from a high level, we've looked at our response in from what we referred to as the 4 R's. Initially, it was all about response. We were governed and guided by our various health authorities, state governments, CDC, etc. I won't talk a lot about response tonight. The next phases that we're working on, the state calls it reopening. We are really looking at reintegration. Part of that is because we've continued to supply essential services along the way and really didn't have a closing per se other than the lobby. And what we're doing there is we're trying to be consistent with the state guidelines, or what's now really become more of the Western State Alliance around situational planning. That is mostly an internal reintegration of staff and other things. We'll talk the most tonight about recovery, which is mostly around the economic and community recovery. What we're referring to as the lifelines that we'd like to provide customers. You've heard about some of those already. And then what that looks like, and then also a replenishment strategy to make sure that we are continuing to be resilient in the long term, including financially resilient. Next slide, please. So the reintegration, like I mentioned, we're looking at several guiding criteria. This would mean, it looks at a few things. One is the feedback loop around symptoms, cases. This would be what Commissioner Carlson referred to as, what if there's another outbreak? What if there's an outbreak within EWEB staff? We would be monitoring that pretty closely, as well as our preparedness. We have 2 versions of PPE there listed. That's actually one of them you're very familiar with, personal protective equipment. The other one is public protective equipment. And so so for example, a cloth mask is more around protecting the public from you rather than you from the public. So we're looking at that in both senses of PPE from our workforce perspective. Can we maintain working spaces correctly? What kind of screening and policies and procedures do we want to have in order to bring a majority of our staff back into the workplace? And then in some cases, which staff do not come back into the workplace because of increased capability around telework or telecommuting. And then the last 3 items there is we're looking at this similar to the state where we have various phases. There's a purpose and a goal for each of those phases. And the gating criteria will then determine how we integrate and how fast we progress through that. Again, most of this relative to internal operations. Next slide, please. From an external perspective, we are working under the assumption that we are facing a period of time where economic recovery is going to be challenging for our community. To get really to be the very specific, we're going to model 3 different levels of impact to our financial system. And most of that is on the revenue side. The revenue, both from a reduced consumption perspective as well as a payment perspective relative to customers' ability to pay. In our modeling, we're going to model a status quo, we're going to model a 5% reduction, and we're going to model a 15% reduction relative to revenue. That's retail revenue specifically. For comparison, in 2008, we experienced a 6.5% revenue reduction. And so we're looking at, I'll say, stakes on both sides of that, some more significant than others, and we're going to model our financial opportunities and challenges within those parameters. We're also going to look at this from a multi-year perspective, anywhere from a remainder of 2020 all the way through 2022. So we're going to model this. That could be a 6-month issue, or it could be a 2.5-year issue. These are the parameters around what we're going to look at and what we're going to model relative to both how wide and how deep this economic challenge might be. Next slide. Oh, by the way, that picture, if you go back, that picture is a food line in Texas, just so you know. Not that we have food lines like that here, and it's not that flat here, but that's just one example of how it's impacting people. Go ahead, next slide, please. I don't expect you to actually be able to read this. This is a daily chart of load. One thing, the red arrow there shows when the state's shelter-in-place order was issued. We track this relative to the need for heating this time of year, and so the number of heating degree days, or how much heat we need to supply our customers, probably drives load more than anything else. But you can see over the last several weeks, that yellow shaded area, we have seen a general trend toward reduced consumption, and this is retail consumption at this point. And I just wanted to point out that it looks like there is some decrease in load already, given probably closing of commercial sites, with some increase in residential sites. Next slide, please. On the other end of the spectrum, the yellow shaded area, that is our 30-day aging number. And so some of the programs, the response that Renee mentioned earlier, it does have an impact. It has a direct impact, and you can see that really since mid-March, that 30-day aging number has roughly doubled. And so as well as the yellow line there, which is our 60-day aging, that's accounts receivable. And so while we think it's going to be very important to supply customers lifelines, we also recognize that there is an ability and a requirement to pay. We want to facilitate that, but we also recognize that there's risk, and in fact, long-term risk around moratoriums on disconnects, for example, and shutoffs, which is something that we really believe is necessary as a backstop. And this is very recent data, and so you can see that there is definitely a trend since we changed our policy toward letting accounts age. And as much as anybody, we want to keep customers, and we want to facilitate their ability to pay. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, Frank, can you just quickly, can you just go back to that slide and just quickly explain what, give us a little more detail on what the aging number, what it means, that metric?
So yep, absolutely. The yellow shaded line there is basically bills people owe us that are more than 30 days old.
Okay, thank you.
And the yellow line would be more than 60 days old.
Okay.
Those are probably the two most important lines there.
Got it.
Great. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we're looking at for recovery, we think there's actually a two-step process. One, as a community-owned utility, we would really like to work with the board and our community around facilitating the economic recovery of the community. We also need to, and this was part of our last conversation, we need to do that within the financial capabilities that we have. And so whether this is 6 months or whether it's 2.5 years, what we're looking at is prioritizing the impacts on the community during that initial period, obviously within the constraints that we have the long-term sustainability of the organization. We, at the end of that, would like to, at some point within that period, return to the pre-pandemic consumption, aging, and exposure and delinquency numbers that we saw before the pandemic occurred. But in this period of time, we want to work with the board on what capabilities and what things that the board might be willing to sacrifice or take some risk on relative to reserve accounts, for example. Even though financial metrics are very specific, and we're fortunate that we're entering this period of time financially strong, we don't want to take risk that would jeopardize our future, but we also know that we're, if anybody, in a good position to be able to help where we can. Following that period, we would look as I call it a replenishment period. This is where we once again rebuild or replenish the financial resiliency that we enjoy today. So the little bit of a two-step process here that we are proposing and would like to work with the board on. Next slide, please. So the recovery period, one of the things that there's different roles and things that would happen in this. We do see that there's probably multiple lifelines. Some of those were described earlier. This is not necessarily a get out of jail free card. We do think that there's opportunities to spread cost or facilitate repayment. Our ultimate goal is to keep customers healthy and help where we can. I think Anna and the team, Renee and Julie, did a good job of presenting this as a way of not putting ourselves at undue risk, especially for customers with what was already a bad credit situation, but helping where we could, trying to prioritize the impacts, especially on rates. You know, one of the things that can happen is that we already do a certain amount of socializing of our cost. And so when one customer cannot pay or goes delinquent on an account, in essence, what happens is their neighbors pay that for them. And at some point, as a board and as an organization, we've agreed that we want to help certain people. We will finance that, but that if it spirals too far, can push rates to the point where further burden on those who are maybe on the edge before also takes place. So we really want to watch these dials pretty carefully. And then within this recovery period also, there's going to be a focus on our spending, both from an expense perspective as well as a capital perspective. There might be some acceleration to certain strategic projects that would also have operational and expense benefits. One example might be AMI. And then we would continue to throttle capital. We'd probably push a little bit on the risk-based category where it doesn't matter if we do something this year or 2 years or 3 years from now. Those are things that we would monitor the trade-off between O&M expense and capital. Next slide, please. In the replenishment period, that's really post helping the community as much as we possibly can afford to without risking our future. We would want to be able to, we've always felt like being resilient has three components. It has an infrastructure component, a financial component, and a workforce component. We think those all need to be important part of our values and how we operate going forward. And so depending on how wide and how deep the economic impact post COVIDity times, I think is what Anna described it as, depending on how wide and how deep, we will look to adjust those dials to make sure we're balancing this helping of the community with not putting ourselves into position that is vulnerable. And so We still have obligations. We have compliance obligations, obligations to serve, keep the lights on, the water flowing, the data flowing, and in some ways the money flowing. Those are all important to sustaining our operation for the betterment of the community going forward. And so we're looking at the 4 R's, which is response, reintegration, recovery, and replenishment. Next slide, please. And so we do think this is going to be pretty severe. We're planning around it, as well as other things. With it, it's not just about 5% or 15%. We'll pay pretty close attention to impacts on secondary markets, for example, where supply and demand might be impacted. We'll look at certain key customers. Anybody in our top 10, we're going to want to pay particularly close attention to relative to their financial health. That could be another issue that we would have to respond to. And we're going to prioritize our recovery to help the community, and also then make sure that we replenish any resiliency sacrifices that we make. And we're going to need to work very closely with you all on the board around managing our strategic risk, our financial policies, and if there are areas that we're willing to relax for a certain period of time, paying close attention to all of these dials. That's a pretty high overview of our approach. There's a lot of details that leadership and management and staff are filling in. Some of those you talked about already. But with that, I'd be happy to answer any sort of, I guess, get guidance and comments so that next month when we bring back more details around some of this and our financial planning, we can make sure we get all of your questions and guidance addressed. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much, President Mattal. I'll turn it back to you.
All right, well, thank you. We've got just a little over 3 minutes remaining on the clock. We could add some, I suppose, if we need to. Are there any comments or observations, questions for Frank? I'll open up a queue. Looks like Commissioner Brown would like to jump. Ian?
Hey, Frank, good presentation. Thank you. I'll just be brief. I assume that you're keeping the city apprised, because with these revenue projections, that's going to be a pretty big hit for them on silt. And I know that they have always thought in the past that we will always raise rates, but we haven't done it for so many years. And now if the rates, if the revenue goes down as much as we may project it, that's going to be a financial hit for them as well. So I hope we're keeping them apprised of this for their budgeting.
Yeah, Commissioner Brown, I've had some generic discussions with the city manager around how we're doing some of the modeling. I don't believe, given her specific numbers yet. I think after 5 years of no raising rates, maybe they're kind of used to it, about the difference between a plan and actuals. We did have a conversation earlier today around comparing notes on how we're responding, and I do plan to provide more specifics, especially after next month when we get guidance from the board as to what potential directions we might take. I will note too that the CARES Act, and I don't remember which version 2 or version 2.5 or 3.5, did add $900 million to Liheap, not Liheap directly, but using the Liheap mechanism. And that is something that may be part of future federal action. And so I just mentioned that because of the context that we just went through relative to EWEB's customer care program and how things might fit in with each other. Those are things that we're monitoring pretty closely, but thank you, Commissioner Brown. I'll make sure that we're communicating with the city.
Other questions, comments, observations? Commissioner Schlossberg.
Thanks. I just have one quick question that you don't have to answer now, Frank, but maybe to address in future meetings. And it's just about the impact on regional adequacy planning. I know that you've been really involved with that, and that there's been a lot of talk about what's going to happen when the coal plants go offline and the need for increased power sources. And I'm just wondering regionally how everybody's thinking about it now, with potentially not needing as much power or having decreased need.
Yeah, it's a good observation, Commissioner. I think there's a couple of things that will probably be noteworthy. We're not hearing significant load reductions yet from our balancing authority, which is Bonneville. They've said there's slight reductions. I think maybe even more important to that, there's kind of two issues. One is resource adequacy tends to look just beyond this 2-year window. So most of our concern has been in the 2 to 5 year window, which still could be part of recovery. The other one is actually the shifting of timing of load, and we've seen that on the electric side of the utility, a shift from a peak in the middle of the day, which would be more aligned with commercial activity, to more of a leveling, including in the evening, because people now are staying at home. So we've seen some profiles that look a little bit different than we have in the past. In fact, the model that we've used is a lot like spring break from a load shape perspective. So it's the timing of it. I think it's a good observation. It's the level of it, and then it's the when is actually that energy consumed. So it's a great observation, and I think people in those conversations around resource adequacy are starting to see what that impact might look like.
All right, our time for this item has elapsed, but if there are other folks who have yet to had a chance to weigh in and would like to, I think we can extend a moment or two. All right, well, seeing none, I think we'll close that out for now and move on to our last two items. Sorry, I got to pull up my agenda again. All right, well, thank you, Frank. We will move. Oh, excuse me, I almost skipped something entirely. It looks like our next item is a quarterly strategic and operational report for 2020. So, Frank, you have another 20 minutes.
Well, I'm not going to take 20 minutes. Thank you, President Mattel. I'm going to actually ask Rod Price to join in on this as well. I have basically, if you could pull up the slide deck, our producer could pull up the slide deck, I'd appreciate it. Next slide, please. So before I turn it over to Rod, I just wanted to make a couple of observations about the first quarter. Rod's going to talk a lot more about some of the capital projects that are taking place. First thing important to recognize, it's the first quarter of the year for us. It's usually a pretty strong quarter from the electric utility perspective. About 30% of our gross margin comes from the first quarter, and it was a bit sluggish. Most of that because of retail consumption due to warmer than unusual weather. Water utility was strong financially, but the flip side is that the water utilities first quarter is usually a very light part of the year. So we have to take both of those financial pictures in context. We did see solid reliability numbers in the first quarter, both water and electric. Some of that lack of storms, for example, and I knock on wood because the wind just blew through here a minute ago. And we just had some over the weekend, but pretty good numbers on the reliability side. One of the success stories over the last year, and it was actually proven again, was we're doing a biofiltration pre-treatment process at Hayden Bridge. We did a successful test this winter, and what we were specifically testing for was to see if that pre-filtration would work when we backwash with cold water, and you get cold water in the winter, and we didn't know how the bioagents would react to that, and they did very, very well. It was a successful test, and the result of that test is low byproducts that when you get chlorine reacting to organic substances, that can create disinfectant byproducts that go through your system. And so that was a very successful test. It aligns with the previous tests that we've done under warmer weather. And so that is proving to be a very good process for our water treatment process. Near the end of the quarter, we got into what we've been talking about mostly so far this meeting, and that's our pandemic response. Again, thanking staff for their foresight, their leadership, and their response to that flexibility. It's been a difficult environment to understand and respond to. Thanks to them. And in all of this, our goals are, we're still progressing on our goals. 6 or 8 are on schedule. The sub-collaboration is a little bit behind schedule, as well as AMI meters, are the meter portion of AMI is a little bit behind schedule. But most of the rest are on schedule, and that's thanks to staff continuing to work in pursuit of those. So with that, it's kind of a high level. I'm going to turn it over to Rod Price, who's going to talk a lot more around capital and capital planning and capital status. So Rod, take it away.
Next slide, please. Thank you, commissioners. Just wanted to take a real quick moment and say thanks for the kind words for staff in the context of Frank's review. I know I appreciate those words, and there's a lot of people on the phone that I know appreciate it as well. So anyway, again, acknowledge the appreciation from you folks. I thought I'd just take a few minutes to pass on some information about questions that you may or may not be having about the capital work and what's going on in the context of our sort of slowdown that we're doing. And talk a little bit about, what some next steps might be. You'll hear more about strategy and that kind of thing. So go ahead and move to the next slide, please. So first thing I want to talk about, because I've heard some questions around this, is, are we supplied? Do we have enough supplies? And it is a concern of ours for sure. And so we have some monthly monitoring going on for our key supplies. Shout out to Sarah Gorsinger, who's doing that. What we're finding, though, is that most manufacturers, of course, are affected by COVID, but they're adjusting to maintain output because of the essential supplies that they give us. So I think the biggest impact has been shipping, which can mean longer lead times. But right now, our warehouse is fully stocked with most of the stuff we need for our projects in emergency situations, including pandemic response supplies, the PPE and the PPE, as Frank calls it. Next slide, please. It's water week, by the way, so I'm going to have some EWEB water because my throat's sticky. Okay, so despite our shelter in place and crew reductions, that kind of thing, we still are getting a lot of work done. And I sprinkled colors throughout the slides because in the past we've been talking about capital in different categories. And so I wanted to continue to sort of illustrate that no one sector of capital is getting impacted perhaps any more than the other. We're still doing a lot of work in a lot of different areas. So in electric in particular, we're focusing on compulsory kind of work, and type 1 work will continue as planned for the year. There's a picture of the downtown network to the right there, putting in some switches to help flexibility of switching around. We've talked a lot to you about the FEMA projects. I think we're got 13 out of 15 done or something like that. I should have looked that up, but we're getting pretty close to finishing those up. We're doing $11 million worth of work up at Carmen in the type 3. In water, we continue our very important reservoir work. Hayden Bridge Lab, that was the picture of the groundbreaking on the first slide you saw. We continue our AMI work. Emergency water sites is another high goal. Another thing that we're working on that we'll probably be talking to you more about coming up is our water resilient spine. And so there's a transmission line being built to help be an alternate path, and there was a consent item about that this evening. So next slide, please. In the other divisions, we continue to focus on customer capital work. What we've noticed is our electric work has been more or less on pace, and water's been down a bit, or the projections. I guess just as importantly, though, I wanted to make sure that you understood we continue to work on compliance. We have dam safety, we've got NERC projects, we have source protection. all these kind of things are still continuing in our work process and on track. IS, they've just plunked right ahead. CEI project, hopefully Julie gets a chance to talk about that upcoming board meetings, but that project is moving along fine. And again, you saw another consent item this evening about that. Our AMI upgrades in the IS department are moving along. Tremendous amount of work from home support, as Frank mentioned earlier. Support services, we are, knock on wood, hopefully weeks away from finishing our remodel work in the Rock, so we can start moving people back over there sometime as we unwind from our shelter in place. And then fleet updates, as well as you saw another consent item tonight on that. So next slide, please. So the question is, well, so what's not getting done, at least for now? We did reduce our field work quite a bit. And so I'm going to talk more about AMI in another slide, but we have paused AMI in deployment of meters in March and April. We expect to start deploying meters again in June. There is some type 1 work that's not getting done in water. The service work and service requests are down. They're expecting a 20 to 30% drop in that by the end of the year, but we'll see. Well, that's all remains up in the air a little bit, of course. But Frank mentioned the risk projects like water main replacements and improvements. Those are not currently being done because folks are sheltering in place. Next slide, please. What's not being done this year? The big one for us in electric is the Carmen Unit 2 runner replacement and generator rewind. There's a couple reasons that's not getting done. Some of the materials where the runner, I believe, was stuck, and maybe still stuck, I don't know, in China due to the COVID shipping. There was also some problems with the some of the materials for the rewind. And then also, of course, the contractor has been sheltered in place also. We took a look at all those kind of factors, and the decision was made to push that project in $8 million into 2021. I mentioned the meter deployment has slowed down. One of the things we had done also is budgeted some money to repair Lieberg Canal. As you remember, the FERC has asked us to not operate the canal until it's repaired. We did budget $2 million this year to work on that, just in case we had a plan. At this point, we're converting some of that to study, and again, I think we're going to come to the board and talk about that maybe next board meeting. And then similar to water, there's some risk-based work that's we're going to push off a little bit. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about AMI. We had, at the very beginning of the year, we had adjusted the deployment rate a little bit, and there was a number of reasons for that. One of the things we did is we took a look at what happened the previous year, and what are the things we could improve on. One of the things we decided that could use some help was we needed some more leadership and some more bodies to manage projects and keep things rolling. So we set up a project team or a program team, and we split into 4 main projects. So while deployment is down, IS projects are full steam ahead right now. We put up the first radio tower. That's a picture from yesterday or Monday of another radio tower going in at Spring Creek. Radio towers, by the way, are key to getting more meters in the field, because we need more radio towers to get more throughput in the opt-out scenario. So we did put a pause on the meter deployment for March and April. Hope to reestablish some deployment in June, especially as we get this tower up and running. We have another tower scheduled for Delta, so that should open up some paths for us. So the other one that's kind of interesting in this one's the meter to cash. One of the things we've talked about is our processes and the number of things going on with CEI, and how how we can merge up some of our process work with that project, as well as the actual installation of meters and how we read meters and how we turn those into billing. So we've created a separate project out of that, and that's just beginning, I think, this month. So I'm sorry, the previous month. So it's well under its way. So next slide, please. So what does that all mean? Right now we're projecting about an 80% spend of our capital budget at the end of the year. This means about 3.6 million in the water utility underspend and about 11 in electric. I think the numbers could vary a little bit just due to customer work. We'll see, at least in water, but in the electric, we have the major portion of it is that $8 million that goes to the runner. So that number's a little more solid. Next slide, please. So finally, I just wanted to touch on, the next steps. We long-term, Frank's talked a lot about the recovery period and the reintegration periods and all these kind of things. So there's a number of things we're looking at in our capital plan, and we're looking at some options about how to change some spending and how that affects the long-term financial plan. Those discussions are coming up in June and July, as you know, the usual budget cycle. One of the things that we will continue doing is things like Carmen and our reservoir projects in the water, working on our resilient spines in both water and electric, and continuing AMI. So there's some projects that we're going to keep, and we're going to keep moving on. The question is, and this becomes more of that strategic discussion, as we bring in impacts of the COVID response, for instance, and you folks talked about reserves and allocating money for different things, and all of that comes into play, I think, in our future capital discussions. And so the McKinsey, the Lieberg Canal impact, triple bottom line, for instance, there's a lot of money wrapped up in some of those decisions. So I think we'll be bringing some of these conversations in front of you. There's a lot of fun, interesting work ahead. I think we have, as Frank puts it, we've got some opportunities in front of us to make some improvements and do some better things. But I think for the next 18 months or so, we're going to be a little slower in the capital world. And with that, I would just open it up to questions. You can move the slide, Travis.
All right, well, thanks Frank and Rod both. We have just about 5 minutes remaining. Are there any questions or comments for either? Looks like we have one from John Brown and then Dick Helvis.
Well, I hate to keep always going first. Thank you, Rod. A great presentation. Just on the reserve funds, I noticed that between working cash and designated funds, we're almost 50 million above target on pages 8 and 10 of the background information. In just working cash alone is almost 17 million. Can you give me a brief synopsis of why we're so far above target?
I can do that a little bit, Commissioner Brown. Some of this will come up as we give a preview of the long-term financial plan next month. Some of it relates to planned spending at Carmen, for example, so that we can offset borrowing. Most of that was allocated other than sort of rate stabilization funding and things like that. I think that the cash position is going to be an important part of the discussion with the board. It's not just about reserves, but it's about the flow of cash. I know historically you're aware that debt service coverage has been the challenge on the electric side, at least during your tenure. But we also think that we may be in a position where we have to watch our cash flow. Just to give you an example, the 15% scenario that we're looking at just for this year would take a $9 to $13 million draw from our reserves. And so those are things that we want to have a real transparent discussion with you all. It looks a little bit inflated, but some of that is pre-planned offset of borrowing.
Okay, because I noticed like our rate stabilization fund was designed to put away 21 million 21.5 million to reduce borrowing, but we're sitting at 24 million. I mean, just things such as that, where we have, you know, that's quite a bit of money above even what our target was.
Yeah, I think this will be an important part of what we talk about next month when we look at the different scenarios, and if there are draws on reserves that the board does those with a really good forward-looking view of what that money was planned for, and then what was maybe just held in reserve for just those kinds of things, which is you know, it's okay. And I think to spend, you know, use one-time reserves for one-time expenses, but we also have replenishment policies that we'll need to work with the board on. So not all that's capital, certainly, but I think it's part of a broader discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Dick, you still have a question? Go ahead.
I just want to look forward to the discussion in June and further on down the road. I think, unfortunately, you know, whether it's in the process of waiting for this to resolve on the public health front or unwinding the impacts, as we've discussed even briefly tonight, this is going to go on for a while, and our response, you know, we're going to have to be nimble, and at the same time, we're going to have to be mindful of the fact that the implications of this will string out over a period of time. I would just hate to see, I'm not sure that I should read the wrong things into Rod's presentation, which was a good one, and thank you for that. But I would hate to see us, I would like us to pursue a path that allows us to resume and keep faith with our strategic plan and our need for continuing infrastructure investments. And I'd hate to see us, well, I understand perfectly a slowdown over the next period of time in our capital work. I'd hate to see us sacrifice the level of our reinvestment in the system over time, simply to deal with near-term operating costs. And I appreciate that, you know, that discussion is part of what we'll get to beginning next month. I'm done.
Commissioner Helgeson, I would echo your sentiments there. I do think that in many ways we manage assets for a community on a long-term basis, and that requires continued investment. It requires prudent investment. I don't think that what we will bring to the board is any kind of strategic sacrifice relative to the things that we think are going to be important. We do know that there's a certain artistic nature to some of the spending that takes place, and we want to make sure we're transparent with that. But I think most, if not all, of the leadership within the utility, and I think the board believes this, that we are an ongoing asset to the community, and we need to be really cognizant about keeping our organization financially healthy, continue to invest in those things that provide delivery of our products and services. And I think we definitely feel like you feel, but also want to make sure we balance that with being sensitive to an economic recovery that might be pretty wide and pretty deep, and we need to be able to adjust to that. But thank you for that comment. We appreciate it.
Commissioner Carlson, I think you had a question. Go ahead.
Okay, just 3 things. One, I really appreciate the information on the supply chain. I know I keep poking on that. It's a lot of what I do constantly, so it's always at the top of my mind. I know that personally, I mean, we're seeing some costs of raw materials skyrocket through the roof. I mean, 3, 4, 5 times what they normally are, because the demand is very huge, or maybe the demand has staved off, but the supply has decreased because the production plants are not in. And while it's wonderful that our supplies are currently stocked, I do think that when you're doing your modeling, for those that we think may be constrained and may still have the same levels of demand, we may need to build in higher costs to provide that for some time. Now, and I'm sure your supply folks are very well connected, but it's just something that, if this continues on and there isn't a reason for the demand to go down for things that support water and electric and so forth, that it's something we should consider in that modeling. I sent an email about CO2. I don't know if that's a piece of water production in our particular facility, but I've seen that that's also something that they're thinking is going to be in shorter supply. I'm curious on that one, if somebody could reply back at some point. It doesn't need to be on this meeting necessarily. And then I wanted to get an update on the debt refinancing. Somebody could just kind of know where we're at. Thanks.
Yeah, President Mattel, do you mind if I respond?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think relative to your second question, we do not use CO2 in our treatment process, and so I thought we had responded to you on that. But unless we're going to convert to seltzer water, we do not use CO2 in our process at this point. As far as our bond refinancing, we took a little bit of a pause. We're starting to crank that back up again as liquidity comes back into the bond market. There for a month or two, it was it was a very difficult market to. It was a higher risk than we would normally want to take relative to those specific bond offerings. We do have a number of months that we can do that, but it looks like it's going to be more in the next month or so, as opposed to 4 or 5 months out. But we did hold off a little bit just because of the lack of liquidity in the bond markets. But it will probably become and continue to be attractive as recovery occurs and as people shift money from other sources of investments.
If I may, just one last comment.
Yep, we are over time, so let's wrap up, please.
Okay. I am curious if there are some projects that we, strategically hold on as well, because we think that, the construction groups, they may not see as much as time wears on for this, and we may be able to get some of those projects at lower costs in the future, if you can get supplies. Okay, thanks.
Any final comments before we move on to our next item? All right. All right. Well, then, thank you. We have just 2 items remaining. It's correspondence and board agendas, and then the board wrap up. My back's killing me. These 3-hour meetings sitting up here in my bedroom all by myself is a bit much. And I missed the neighborhood howl. So I hope you all have neighborhood howls in your neck of the woods. We have one in ours. It's really fun. 8 o'clock. All right, Frank, take us home.
President Mattel, commissioners, thank you. There were 4 informational items under correspondence. Any of those, you feel free to reply with comments. The one was an update on our risk assessment associated with the America Water Infrastructure Act. That was kind of a high-level assessment that we did with final action plans due this fall, and so there'll be more as we go through the capital process and updating you on that. Some brief kind of initial reserve transfers that obviously becomes part of a larger conversation. That was just an initial recommendation relative to properly funding some of the previous retirement plans. There was a proposed change to the consent item process, and we could actually try this out next month. This was there seems to be kind of 2 categories of consent items. Some of those are very much dictated by statute and board policy, where we might get multiple proposals, multiple bidders, and we go through an award process. Those are pretty standard. And then there might be another one where we would want to focus more attention, which would be kind of the exceptions to the rules or particular agreements. It's our way of maybe trying to segment those out so that you can kind of know what's what's filling a standard versus what may be a little bit more abnormal. And if you'd like, we could just try it next month and see how it works, see if it's of benefit. And then the final one was a report out on our flow regime this year at Walterville being based on the snowpack and our projection that we will have a slightly reduced flow into the project to keep more than 10% of the flow in the river. And so that's a process we go through every year, and we did the assessment, and that was based on snowpack projections. And so if you have any questions on those, I could either answer those or call on staff as needed, or we can just take feedback between now and next meeting if you'd like.
Well, I'll just take a quick poll in response to your question on consent calendar. Frank's proposing to give the new approach a try. I'm game personally, looking for at least a couple other hands to see if there's willingness to support that. And I got one from Sonia, and Commissioner, looks like we're in more or less minus Dick, but that's just how it goes. All right, Frank, you get your wish. If anybody else has any comments about those 4 items, now's your chance. Otherwise, we'll go into board wrap up and be done.
President Mattel, I had one more thing, and that's the future agendas. One of the things that I'll just give you a little bit of heads up on, and this will be for me to work with you, President Mattel, and Vice President Schlossberg on. The June agenda looks like it's going to be a pretty packed agenda because we're going to add some conversation around the financial planning and how we approach, for example, our customer care levels and things like that. So just as a heads up, that either might be a abnormally long meeting with a lot of great content, or Commissioner Mattel and Schlossberg, we may have to work to see if there's some things that could be either informational or pushed off a month. But just as a heads up, that is going to actually be more packed than it already appears. And so we'll talk about that. I am expecting at this point that we will have our June meeting in person based on projections. If we do that, we will have certain likely distancing, PPE potentially, and I'll say a hygienist or someone capable of making sure that we're living up to the safety policies and health policies. But I am planning at this point on having that meeting in person, but that's subject to some of those criteria that we talked about earlier. I'm hoping it to be in person.
All right, well, thank you. Our final agenda item is just a board wrap up. We'll go down the aisle in the same order in which we've taken everything else. So Mindy, you're first.
Just really quick, I want to thank the IT help for this, to make this meeting possible. So thank you to Travis and Ann and Holly and whoever helped us set it up. I wasn't familiar with Teams, and it's worked really well.
Good, thank you. Thank you. Commissioner Carlson.
Yeah, I echo that. This went much more smoothly than the last meeting. It was great to actually be able to see everybody. I would personally be very surprised if we were back in June, but I would love to see it, Frank. That's all I've got. Thanks.
Dick, go ahead.
Good meeting. The technology worked well. I appreciate the help with that. I know I'm probably going to get, somebody's going to push the ejector button on me here, but I think there's enough in this conversation about what if scenarios around kind of COVID recovery and our financial situation that's almost something that, particularly if we got a heavy meeting in June, might deserve its own meeting. I guess I just throw that out there for the officers' consideration, with the recognition that it's probably pretty unlikely, but I would be willing, as one board member anyway, if necessary, to devote an entire work session to that conversation. And again, it's the one that follows up on Frank's indications of how we might be looking to talk about a path forward and kind of that financial balance that we'll ultimately need to strike. But otherwise, good meeting. I appreciate seeing everybody.
Yeah, likewise. And yeah, at least it's on my mind that if we end up in a video situation again next month, we'll just have to see how that goes. I know, at least my experience this time, sitting here for 3 hours is harder than sitting, significantly harder, at least for me, than sitting in the normal commissioner seats, you know, in full view of everybody. So if we get stuck in this situation once again and we have a particularly heavy load, I might also look to you all for your willingness to split it out into 2 meetings spread across the month of June, but we'll cross that bridge not for a few more weeks. Commissioner Brown?
Yeah, I echo all the other sentiments. Just a reminder that when I started on this board, we always had 2 meetings a month, and it's not something that's not atypical, and I'm more than willing to do it because I think we've got a situation coming up that is unprecedented, and if we need another meeting, so be it. That's why we're here, is to get the job done. So I'm all for, not that I want another meeting, you know me and meetings and time, but I certainly would not say no. I'd support it wholeheartedly because I think we have a lot of heavy lifting coming up.
All righty, any other final items before we close this out? All right, then I am going to adjourn this meeting. Thanks, everybody. See you soon. Travis, can I hit the eject button?
You certainly may, sir.
Thank you,
All right.
commissioners.
3,
Thank you.
2, 1.
Thank you, commissioners.
Bye-bye, everybody.